Today we got some more actual history from the early days of the American Republic in Kentucky around 1788. This is the final episode of the story of the captivity of Mrs. Jennie Wiley. We will be reading from this book, Eastern Kentucky Papers, the Founding of Harman Station, with an account of the Indian Captivity of Mrs. Jennie Wiley, and the exploration and settlements of the Big Sandy Valley in the Virginias and Kentucky. This book was published by William Elsey Connelley all the way back in 1910. So when we left off in episode 2, Jennie Wiley had heard a male prisoner put to death, and she herself had almost been put to death, but the Cherokee chief decided instead to purchase her from the Shawnee. This episode first follows the perspective of Jennie's brother-in-law, John Borders, as well as Matthias Harman, in their search for her after she was captured. We will then return to the perspective of Jennie Wiley and a vision she had that encouraged her to try to escape. It was late in the day when John Borders returned home from the search for his sheep, and a thick and foggy darkness was settling over the valley of Walker's Creek. When he found that Mrs. Wiley had not yet arrived at his house, he feared that harm had come to her and her family, and her sister, Mrs. Borders, was distressed and anxious. Borders sought a neighbor who lived near him, and together they went to the Wiley house, which they found partly burned. After some time spent in a cautious examination of the place, they ventured to enter the house, where they found the bodies of the slain children. The animals about the place were excited, and Borders believed the Indians were yet lying in wait to do further murder. Not finding Mrs. Wiley and her child, they were uncertain of her fate, but they supposed none of the family had escaped death. No light was kindled by Borders and his companion, and after a short time spent in making the examination by which they learned the facts set out above, they left the house and alarmed the settlers. The Indians had been seen by no one, and the uncertainty in the minds of the people as to their number and further purpose spread terror in the settlements. No attempt could be made to follow the Indians during the night. Those most capable of determining just what to do in this extremity were out of the settlement, and it was not known when they would return. On the following morning, a number of settlers gathered at Wiley's cabin and looked the premises over carefully, but the trail of the Indians was not discovered. From some cause it was supposed that the Indians had gone down the New River. Thomas Wiley and a dozen settlers followed the Indian road down that stream, hoping to come up with the Indians, but no tidings of Mrs. Wiley came from that pursuit. In the afternoon of the day after the attack upon Wiley's house, Matthias Harman and the hunters returned to the settlements. The swollen streams and the heavy loads carried by their horses had delayed them 24 hours. But for these impediments, they would have arrived in time to have prevented the murders committed by the Indians. The confidence of the settlers that they would arrive in the settlement before the Indians had caused them to neglect to send a runner to warn the settlers of their danger. Immediately upon his return, Matthias Harman went to the house of Wiley, where he found many of the settlers. He made a minute examination of the country around the house. In the hills north of the house, he found evidences that the Indians had passed that way. He followed this discovery some miles, and upon his return to the cabin, he assured the settlers that Mrs. Wiley was alive and a prisoner, that she was carrying her child which had been spared, and that the Indians would follow the Tug River war trail and try to cross the Ohio to their towns. It was his opinion that the Cherokee chief was the leader of the band, the number of which he had determined from the trail. He was confident that he could overtake the Indians and recover the prisoners. His purpose to do this was determined upon at once. Harman was a bold and active man. He believed this raid was made more by accident than by design, and that it indicated no uprising of the Indians, nor any purpose to harass the settlements. It was not regarded as of sufficient importance to delay the settlement to be made at the mouth of John's Creek. He assembled those interested in that enterprise, and gave them instructions as to what they should carry with them, when to set out, what to do in case they should arrive before he could return there from pursuit of the Indians, and the most favorable route for them to take on the journey. There were about 25 men in this colony, but the exact number is not known, and their names are lost to us. We know that among them were Matthias Harman, Absalom Lusk, Henry Skaggs, James Skaggs his brother, Robert Hawes, Daniel Harman, Adam Harman, and Henry Harman. It is believed that a man named Horn, also one named Leek, were with the colonists. Harman selected 10 of the most experienced Indian fighters to go with him in pursuit of the party having Mrs. Wiley and her child in captivity. Thomas Wiley was not a member of this colony and did not go out with them. Mr. Wiley had not returned from the pursuit made down the New River, so his son always said. He also said that his father was unnerved by the destruction of his family, and that he was at the time unfit for the warpath. Matthias Harman and his company of hunters set out early in the day in pursuit of the Indians. So confident that he was right did Harman feel that he did not at first attempt to follow the trail made by the Indians, but went directly to the headwaters of the Bluestone River and crossed the Great Flat Top Mountain. He found the trail of the Indians in the hills about the head of the Tug River. It followed the old Indian warpath as Harman had conjectured. This ancient way was so well defined that it required no effort to discover and follow it, which made their pursuit rapid and certain. Each camp of the Indians was discovered, and it was plain that the Indians were being gained upon every day. If the Indians had not left the old warpath and turned down the small streams to Tug River, they would have been overhauled by Harman and his party in a few hours. It was difficult traveling on horseback along the small streams, for they were frequently choked with thickets. This caused delay when rapid movement was so necessary. Harman saw that the Indians were not far in advance, and were aware of the presence of the party in pursuit. Just before night they found the body of Mrs. Wiley's child, which they buried in a shallow grave, hastily dug with tomahawks and scalping knives. A few minutes after the Indians had plunged into the water and crossed Tug River, Harman and his men stood upon the spot they had left. It was impossible to get the horses across the river in its flooded condition on such a night. The party camped on the bank of the river and spent the night in building rafts, upon which to carry over the baggage in the morning. Harman effected a safe crossing early the following day. It was past noon when he again found the Indian trail, which wound through a country so rough and hilly that it was well nigh impossible to follow it with horses. When he arrived at the point where the Indians had crossed the Louisa River, it was the unanimous opinion of all the hunters that it was useless to follow the trail further. They all believed that it would be impossible to come up with the Indians. Mrs. Wiley was relieved of the burden of her child, and the Indians, being apprised of the pursuit, would hold their course to the rough, bush-grown stony ridges where horses could scarcely go. So, with regret, the pursuit was abandoned at the Louisa River. From the point where the Indian trail was abandoned, Harman and his company ascended the Louisa River to the mouth of John's Creek and went into camp in the old hunting lodge built there by Harman more than 30 years before. There the river runs against the bluff on its west side, leaving a broad bottom on the east side of the river below the mouth of John's Creek. It was an ideal place for a pioneer settlement. The great warpath up the river ran on the west side of the stream at that point. There the stream is deep. John's Creek is a stream of considerable size, having its sources in the mountain ranges about the headwaters of the Tug and Louisa rivers. Should the larger streams be beset with Indians, the valley of the smaller one would afford a safe way to the settlements in Virginia. The bottom in which it was designed to build the fort of the settlement was then covered with trees ranging in size from the shrub to the giant sycamore with its girth of 40 feet. These trees were of several varieties: birch, beech, maple, linn, oak, poplar, and others. It was covered with a thick growth of cane, which furnished winter pastures for buffalo, elk, and deer, and which was an indication of deep and lasting fertility. The colonists expected directly from Virginia did not arrive for some days after the coming of Harman and his company. Their horses were heavily packed, and their progress through forests and over streams was necessarily slow. High water hindered much. The site selected for the fort was almost half a mile below the mouth of John's Creek, and about 100 yards back from the east bank of the Louisa River. The fort was built on the plan common to the forts in frontier settlements. The upper story projected beyond the walls of the lower story about 2 feet on every side, and this extra space was floored with heavy timbers in which loopholes were cut through which to fire down upon besieging Indians, should they ever come to such close quarters. The walls of both stories were provided with openings through which to fire upon a foe. The door or gate was made of split oak timber 6 inches in thickness. It was hung upon strong wooden hinges made by the hunters, opened inward, and was secured by an immense beam of oak. The roof sloped up from each of the 4 sides of the fort to a point in the center, and was made of thick slabs of white oak timber pinned to the log ribs or rafters with long wooden pins or pegs driven into holes bored with an auger. A small stream flowed from the hills back of the bottom and passed close by the fort, and upon it the settlers relied for water. The timber about the fort was cut off close to the ground, and burned back the full space of rifle range. This was done to deprive the Indians of cover should they ever besiege the fort. This rude and strong building, thus erected by the rough backwoodsmen of the Virginia frontier, all of whom were as brave and hardy as any who ever founded a frontier post, was the famous blockhouse. The settlement commenced by its erection was called Harman Station. It was the first settlement made in eastern Kentucky. There was at that time no settlement in either of the present counties of Pike, Floyd, Lawrence, Boyd, Greenup, Carter, Elliott, Morgan, Wolfe, Magaffin, Breathitt, Knott, Letcher, or Martin counties. There were no settlements on the Tug River, and none in any of the present counties of West Virginia touching that stream. This fort was built by Matthias Harman and backwoodsmen whom he had induced to cast their lots with him in the wilderness. The fort was built in the winter of 1787 and 88. After passing through the horrors of such an ordeal as that to which she had been subjected, Mrs. Wiley found it impossible to sleep. She had nerved herself to face death with resignation, and her nerves were unstrung with the relaxation following her unexpected deliverance from the stake. And she was troubled by the change of masters. She feared the Cherokee. He was in every way different from the Shawnee chief. He was quick and energetic of action, cruel, savage, and treacherous by nature, always restless and anxious to be moving. While she believed that she owed her life to his interference in her behalf, she was not sure the future would prove that she would have much to be thankful for in that matter. Her chance of escape seemed cut off, and that troubled her. She regretted that she had not made the effort to escape months before. While pondering over these things, she fell into a broken and troubled sleep. She found this a most strange sleep, for she seemed more awake than ever. She was never sure she was asleep at all, but she always insisted that she saw this vision, or had this remarkable dream. The young man so lately tortured by the Indians came to her bearing in his hand a lamp made from the bleached skull of a sheep, the brain cavity of which was filled with buffalo tallow, in which was a wick that was burning brightly. The young man did not speak, but by signs indicated that she must follow him. Then her bonds fell away. The young man threaded the deep defiles of the forest, with the flame of his lamp fluttering in the wind. He did not look back to see if she were following him. Arriving at a steep mountain of great height, he rapidly ascended it. When he reached the top, he blew strongly upon his lamp flame, which immediately leaped to a height sufficient to reveal the whole country below. She looked where he pointed across a river. There stood a fort erected by white men. As she was anxiously appealing to him for information as to who dwelt there, the light paled, flickered a moment, and then was gone. She was left alone in the darkness, and was immediately aroused from her slumber. This dream or manifestation or phenomena, by whatever name, was repeated twice, the last time being just as the Indians began to stir in the camp. Mrs. Wiley was unbound by the Cherokee, and informed by him that it was his purpose to set out on the journey to his town in a day or two, but that he was going that morning to the great buffalo lick on Big Mudlick Creek to kill game. It was not long until the whole band of Indians left the camp. Mrs. Wiley was again bound and left in the camp in the rock house. She soon fell into a deep sleep, from which she was wakened by the roaring of a heavy storm of wind and rain. The instant that she awoke, the peculiar dream came to her mind with great force. It seemed to be a call to her to make an effort to escape. At least she so regarded it, and she decided to act upon it. She saw the wind was blowing the rain into one corner of the rock house. She rolled herself over and over until she lay in this rain blown by the wind. It was but a short time until the rawhide thongs with which she was bound were soaked and became slippery and easily removed. When free, she bound her dog to a large stone to prevent his following her, seized a tomahawk and a scalping knife, and descended quickly to the bed of Little Mudlick Creek. She waded that stream to its junction with the larger stream, which she waded to Big Paint Creek. There she remembered that she had no well-defined plan for action. But after a little time spent in reflection, she remembered that she had seen a river in her dream, and concluded that she might reach this river by wading continuously downstream. She acted upon that conclusion. She found it difficult to wade in Big Paint Creek. It is a deep, swift stream, and the heavy rain quickly raised the small streams flowing into it, and they carried in muddy water, which soon made it impossible for her to determine the depth. She was often carried off her footing, and more than once was in danger of drowning. Big Paint Creek makes a big bend which she was compelled to follow around, and it was growing dusk when she was at the mouth of the Rock House branch. At the mouth of Jennie's Creek, she crossed Paint Creek. She waded up Jennie's Creek, which the heavy rain had put out of its banks. Wind and rain continued all night. When she reached the forks of Jennie's Creek, she was almost exhausted, and for a time there she was much puzzled as to which branch of the stream she should follow. Her choice of branches was right. She turned to the left and followed the Lick Fork. In half a mile she was again compelled to choose between two branches of the stream, for there the middle fork falls into the Lick Fork. She again turned to the left, and again her choice was right. She followed the Lick Fork to the mouth of a small branch coming in from the east. Here she left the larger stream and followed the little one to its head, where she crossed through a gap to the stream now known as the Bear Branch, which she descended to its junction with Little Paint Creek. Continuing down the latter stream, she stood upon the bank of the Louisa River, as the dull dawn of a cloudy morning appeared in the east. It is unnecessary to dwell here upon the exhausted condition of Mrs. Wiley. She had waded against swift currents of overflowed streams for more than 12 hours, and had been wading for as much as 18 hours. She dragged herself up the bank of the river and soon came opposite the blockhouse. She saw women and children there, but no man was in sight. She called out to make her presence known, and for assistance to cross the river. So unexpected a cry alarmed the people at the fort, and they went in hurriedly and closed the gate. Here was a wholly unlooked-for discouragement. Mrs. Wiley was impatient and anxious, fully expecting to be followed by the Indians. Seeing now the blockhouse, she reasoned that the Indians knew of its existence, and would seek her in that direction. She was fearful that they might appear at any minute. She continued to call to the people in the fort, calling out her name and saying that she had escaped from the Indians, whom she expected to follow her. After what appeared to her to be a long time, an old man came out of the fort. She recognized him at once as Henry Skaggs, an old-time friend of her father. It did not require her much time to convince him that she was Jennie Wiley, and that she stood in great danger of being recaptured by the Indians. Skaggs knew the Cherokee chief well. He saw that no time was to be lost in getting her across the river. He told Mrs. Wiley that the men in the fort, except himself, had gone away early in the morning with the canoes. He said they would not return for some time, and that he would be compelled to construct a raft upon which to bring her over. He advised her to endeavor to swim across should the Indians appear, as it was his opinion that she would suffer death if recaptured. A dead mulberry tree stood on the bank of the river, and Skaggs and the women went vigorously to work to fell it. It was tall and had but few branches. When it fell, it very fortunately broke into 3 pieces of about equal length. These logs were hastily thrown into the river, and bound together with long grapevines pulled down from the forest trees where they grew wild. Placing 2 rifles upon the raft, Skaggs pulled out into the river, which was full to overflow, and which was carrying much drift. After being carried far down the stream, Skaggs made a landing. Mrs. Wiley stepped upon the rude raft, and it was again pushed into the stream. When in midstream, the raft was caught by drift, and nearly pulled to pieces, but by hard work both raft and drift were brought to some overhanging trees standing on the east bank. The branches of those trees were seized, and the raft brought to shore about half a mile below the blockhouse. When Mrs. Wiley and Skaggs had gone up the river to the fort, and were about to enter the gate, Indian yells broke from the thickets over the Louisa. A moment later, a large band of Indians came into view, among them the Cherokee chief, and with them was Mrs. Wiley's dog. The Cherokee chief saw Mrs. Wiley at the entrance to the fort. He called out to her to know why she had left him after he had saved her life, and paid his silver for her. He insisted that she had not treated him as she should have done, and closed his appeal with the words, "Honor, Jennie, honor!" She did not reply to him. Skaggs fired his rifle in the direction of the Indians, though the distance was too great for the range of small arms. At the discharge of the rifle, the Cherokee turned about, and with a defiant gesture uttered a fearful whoop, in which he was joined by his warriors. Seeing that Mrs. Wiley had escaped and that he could not recapture her, the Cherokee chief disappeared into the woods, followed by his Indian companions and Mrs. Wiley's dog. The report of the gun discharged by Henry Skaggs brought the men back to the blockhouse. Later in the day, after some preparation, the men crossed the river and followed the trail of the Indians almost to Little Mudlick Creek. From Mrs. Wiley's account of the number of Indians at the camp, the hunters believed they had a force too small to attack them, so they returned after having gone to the mouth of Jennie's Creek. It was not improbable that the Indians would attack the fort soon, and upon the return of the hunters things were put in a posture of defense. No attack was made upon the blockhouse, but the Indians prowled about it for several days, and they were in the vicinity for some weeks. Mrs. Wiley found friends in the blockhouse. Most of the settlers were well known to her in Virginia. She was anxious to return to her husband and relatives. When the winter was well commenced, a party commanded by Matthias Harman took her to her Virginia settlements and restored her to her husband and relatives. On the way, the party was attacked several times, but succeeded in beating off the Indians. It was unusual to find Indians in the woods in the winter, and from this circumstance it was feared that they would prove exceedingly troublesome to the settlers at the blockhouse the next summer. Mrs. Wiley was in captivity for about 11 months. After her return, she and her husband lived in Virginia for about 12 years. They then moved to Kentucky, settling on the Big Sandy River just above the mouth of Tom's Creek in what is now Johnson County, and some 15 miles from the blockhouse and 10 or 12 miles from the old Indian town at the mouth of Little Mudlick Creek. The Presbyterians had no church organization in that part of Kentucky, and she and her husband were members of the Baptist Church. Thomas Wiley died where he first settled in Kentucky about the year 1810, and Mrs. Wiley remained a widow 21 years, dying of paralysis in the year 1831. They left a large family, and their descendants live now in the Big Sandy Valley, and are numerous and respectable. The Indians attacked the blockhouse several times during the summer of 1788. The settlers surrounded it with a stockade. The Indians maintained something of a siege which lasted for about 3 weeks. This was in September. On account of their presence all the time, no crops could be raised that summer. Several of them were killed by the settlers. Some of the settlers became discouraged, and as soon as cold weather enabled them to do so, they returned to the Virginia settlements. Thus weakened, it was not believed that the fort could be defended for another year. The settlers all returned to Virginia during the winter of 1788 and 89. The Indians immediately destroyed the blockhouse. It was burned together with some cabins which the settlers had erected in the vicinity. In the winter of 1789 and 90, some of these settlers returned to the blockhouse site. They were accompanied by other settlers, a majority of whom were from Lee and Scott counties in Virginia. They erected a second blockhouse where the first one had stood, but it was not so substantially built as was the first one. The settlement was troubled much by Indians for several years, but it was never again broken up. It is believed that Matthias Harman did not again settle permanently in the blockhouse bottom, though he was there for some years. He died in Tazewell County, Virginia. Daniel Harman became a permanent settler in the vicinity of the first settlements, and his descendants in the Big Sandy Valley are many. They are industrious and are good citizens. Henry Skaggs and James Skaggs both returned to Kentucky. They lived for some years in the vicinity of the blockhouse bottom, but when times were settled they went to live on the headwaters of Big Blaine Creek. Their descendants live now on Big Blaine Creek, the Little Sandy River, and the Licking River. The Leaks came with the second settlement, and their descendants are yet to be found on the Louisa River. The same can be said of the Horns. An account of the families which came with the settlers in the second colony will be furnished at some time in the future. Mrs. Wiley always insisted that she had no knowledge of the existence of the blockhouse when she left the rock house at the falls of Little Mudlick Creek. She had seen a fort beyond a river in her dream the night before her escape, and she supposed that by descending the creeks she could reach the river. Her contention is upheld by the facts developed in the flight. It was almost dark when she was at the mouth of the Rock House branch, and at the mouth of Jennie's Creek it was dark and was raining very hard. She said something told her that she must cross to Jennie's Creek and then follow it. To do this was to abandon her original plan of following downstream until she found the river. At the mouth of Jennie's Creek she was not 2 miles from the Indian camp. If she had known anything of the route up Jennie's Creek, she could have reached the mouth of the creek in less than an hour by following the route of the present highway between the 2 points, and the amount of rain falling would have enabled her to wade small streams all the way and conceal her trail. Her ignorance of the physical features of the surrounding country saved her, for it was afterward discovered that when the Indians found that she had escaped, they supposed that she had gone directly to the mouth of Jennie's Creek, and they followed that route in their first search for her. While it was yet light, they were scouring the banks of Paint Creek, and those of the lower courses of Jennie's Creek, seeking some sign of her. And finding none, they abandoned the idea that she had set out for the blockhouse over that route. From the footprints of the Indians discovered by the settlers, and other signs left by the Indians, they supposed that the Indians had not been gone an hour when Mrs. Wiley reached the mouth of Jennie's Creek. Jennie's Creek was given its name in her honor, and because she made her escape in wading several miles against its rapid current. Mrs. Wiley said that it was perfectly plain to her that she must take the left-hand branch as she was traveling at the forks of Jennie's Creek, and the same thing occurred at the mouth of the middle fork, and it would seem a miracle that anyone could find the mouth of the small branch where the stream ran out of the Lick Fork. It must be remembered that it was pitch dark, and the whole country was covered with a heavy forest, beneath the boughs of which it would be dark on even a starlit night. The darkness, dense as it was, had torrents of rain to augment it. The streams were running bank full, and for many miles she pushed against the current. Considered from any point, the achievements of Mrs. Wiley that night were most remarkable. I doubt it is equaled in the annals of the border. Her adventures have in them all the requisites of a romance of border life, and the subject is worthy of the ablest pen. In all his recitals to me, Mr. Wiley never omitted to include the fact that his mother was to be the daughter of the Shawnee chief. The formal adoption, he insisted, could not be made until the Indians reached the town of the Shawnees. Consequently, she could not be given in marriage to anyone before they reached there. Being to all intents and purposes the daughter of the chief, Mr. Wiley maintained that his mother was safe from violation and escaped that humiliation. I have heard statements to the effect that an Indian daughter was born to Mrs. Wiley after her escape and return to the Virginia settlements. Mr. Burris writes me that he has heard the same thing. I have been told that Adam P. Wiley was the son of the Shawnee. That was certainly untrue, for Mr. Wiley was born in 1798. Some versions of the captivity of Mrs. Wiley had it that she was carried to Old Chillicothe, and that the sale to the Cherokee occurred there, after which she was carried to the old Indian town at the mouth of Little Mudlick Creek by the Cherokee as his wife. There was never any uniformity in these versions, and they always appeared to me as mere conjecture of those having indefinite information. It was natural, of course, for Mr. Wiley to believe that his mother escaped violation. It is the province of the historian to state all the facts in his possession, and I have performed that duty to accuracy in historical accounts in this instance. To those familiar with psychology and psychical phenomena, remarkable dreams or manifestations to one under stress of nervous excitement or great strain or disturbance of the mental faculties are not strange. They are not impossible, improbable, nor even unusual. Volumes could be filled with authentic instances of such dreams or manifestations. Mrs. Wiley always believed that she was assisted by this dream to make her escape. She believed after this dream that there were white people in the country about her. The route by which the settlement could be reached was unknown to her and had not been seen in her dream. The young man led her straight through the woods to a high mountain which does not in fact exist. But she saw it in her dream, and from the top of it, she saw the fort and a settlement of her own people. So that's it for this episode, and for our 3-part series on Jennie Wiley. Some of you who have watched this channel for a while may have noticed the similarities between the vision Jennie Wiley had and the story of Josiah Wilbarger, who was scalped by Comanches in Texas in 1833. Wilbarger barely survived, and as he lay half dead in the woods, his sister, who had just passed away in another state the previous day, came to him in a dream and told him to have no fear, and that help was on the way. His sister then moved off in the direction of Reuben Hornsby's cabin. That night, Sarah Hornsby, Reuben's wife, also had a dream in which she could see Wilbarger still clinging to life in the woods. She awoke and alerted her husband, and they went and found Wilbarger the next day. This story also shares some similarities to that of Fanny Kelly. We have done a 17-episode series on the captivity of Fanny Kelly here on Unworthy History, so be sure to check that out if you haven't watched it. This channel is called Unworthy History because we talk about actual history that is now deemed unworthy to be shown on history channels on TV. And because we talk about people who lived long before us and who lived much more difficult lives than we have to today. People whose shoes we are unworthy to stand in. If you'd like to help keep this unworthy history alive, then consider joining our Patreon page. Patreon members will have their chosen names listed at the end of each episode. So if you want to see more episodes like this, then be sure to like and subscribe, and we'll see you next time on Unworthy History.